there's an enormous amount of established retail. It's very, very, very good value. It's tremendous value. In fact, it's some of the best value at the moment. Like a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom there, 630.
Hello, everybody. This is Domenic Nesci, and welcome to another episode of the Wealthi podcast. Today, we have Simon Hollows, the Director of CBRE Residential Sales. Simon has been doing this for a very long time. I've watched him personally do presentations on the market, where it's going, and he's a gentleman I like to catch up for a coffee every now and then just to find out what's actually happening in the Sydney market. So, Simon, thank you for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Dom.
Simon, you've been doing this a while now. Is there something about this market that feels a little different to other markets that we've been working in before?
Yeah, look, I've been doing this for, the better part of 11 years. Seen it come and go. Obviously, it was a very different market 15, 16. This market presents its challenges, but it also, I feel like, we're sort of not history repeating itself. We're making history. This time around, we've got, ideally, we're going to see some good population growth once migration comes back and that sort of thing. There's a lot of infrastructure projects that are improving planning around certain suburbs and accessibility and ways to get around Sydney. So I think we're making history. Obviously, the global pandemic and what's happened with COVID 2 years in a row now isn't sort of supporting that. But, where one door, some doors close, another door opens, So it's going to be very interesting to see how it all bounces back. And I'm confident that it will come back. It'll come back stronger than ever, and it'll be fierce. And like I said, I think we'll make history.
So on COVID, because obviously that's the tip of everybody's tongue, how has it impacted you, your team? Are you seeing a lot of demand, or has it come off quite a lot? What's been your experiences of COVID and people out there that are buying?
Look, it's a combination of things. We've seen a very strong demand. Obviously, we can see the housing market has been extremely resilient, and there's a huge demand on the back of things like low interest rates. Obviously, a lot of people have been impacted by what's happened. Their business or their sort of main source of income has been impacted, and we obviously have to sympathise with that. But a lot of people are sort of in a position where they can spend more on a property, whether they're selling something and taking advantage of the increase in prices and having surplus funds to buy something bigger or in a different suburb that's superior than what they came out of. Downsizers obviously capitalising on the market. And first home buyers taking advantage of government incentives and low interest rates has been a big driving force behind the first home buyer demand. So there's certainly been some activity that a lot of people, I'll say, probably didn't anticipate on the back of what happened last year with the lockdowns and that sort of thing. And the market's proven itself to be extremely resilient. Last year they announced, it was the global pandemic and a recession at the same time, and the Sydney property markets withstood the test of time. So certainly a lot of people are seeing the results of that and then sort of jumping in the market, and that's where the demand's coming from.
So with that in mind, people stepping into the market, we've got all the government grants, record low interest rates, people downsizing, jumping houses, moving about quite a lot. And there has been strong demand. How have developers responded to it? How are the different sites responding? Are you seeing price increases? Are some developers more scared and dropping prices, trying to accelerate sales? What's the sentiment from the vendor side of things?
Look, it depends. I mean, you've got projects that are in very strong areas of transportation and strong amenity with high quality, I'll say, finish and workmanship, are still achieving strong price results. So that's particularly in the luxury and higher end space. Around the Sydney CBD, recently we launched the Sirius building at the Rocks. It was a tremendous result there of about 400 million in the first open weekend, or the VIP launch weekend. And that just shows there's a very strong demand for people to be in, as I say, premium locations with obviously trophy views and that sort of thing. So that sector's performing extremely well. Other sectors where there's say a saturation of apartments or a lot of competition, there's had to be a bit more of a buyer incentive to entice people to buy there. So it's a mixed bag just depending on what the project is. I think apartment buildings that are in towers and as I say to you, saturated locations are feeling the competition a little bit. It's quite fierce. So, buyers have a luxury of choice. But projects, as I say, in good locations with strong amenity, strong transportation links are performing quite well.
So if I read between the lines, I'm mindful of what performs well. That what you would like to do in some instances is just jump on the bandwagon, follow the growth. But then there are other investors that will pay attention to what isn't performing as well. Do you see some of these locations that have a bit of an apartment saturation, or these sort of infill sites or greenfield sites where there is quite a lot of supply, or they haven't gotten as much attention as the other parts of the market? Do you see them as opportunities for the immediate future?
It's something that you've got to sort of try, and no one has a crystal ball, but use educated, I'll say, guessing as to what's going on. So, for example, you've got places like Rouse Hill, Tallawong, which people don't traditionally sort of think about as a primary purchase, but you're looking at a suburb that's got an enormous amount of infrastructure coming up. There's an enormous amount of money being invested in those locations. There is, established housing and ongoing projects there, but I don't think it's anywhere near its full capacity. So when you take a suburb that's sort of just starting to bloom and flourish, and you buy in there early, then you're going to benefit enormously on the tail end of those areas being established, because that's where the fiercest demand comes in, is when everything's sort of fully established and running and operating. And so buying in early in those sort of suburbs, I think, is key for people to take advantage of significant uplift in their property. Whereas if you come in on the tail end and you're competing with the broader market and there's a saturation and it's bursting out the seams, I think you're sort of paying premium and already, I'll say, copying the uplift that's been there. So there's certainly opportunity if you look for it in the right places. And there's even other obvious precincts, like anything around, for example, the Parramatta CBD. We've seen suburbs in central Sydney or eastern Sydney where people used to go, I'd never live in Redfern, or I'd never live in Marrickville, or I'd never live in Newtown. And these are extremely competitive and highly high demand suburbs. So you can't write anything off just based on a stigma or what your friends say. You've got to really think about, the meat and potatoes of it, So it's important to understand what the reasonable foreseeable future is of those suburbs and just dive in there, because
That's really interesting.
It will pay you dividends.
I really like, there's two things that I like in that. One, being a first mover in an emerging suburb. It is good because people don't typically look, 3, 5, 10 years into the future. So if you can look into the future, you can see that there's going to be some government infrastructure, some growth, a town centre is going to evolve and start to mature. It is good to get in at grassroots. It's typically risky because you don't see anything, and it might be your building or your house with not many neighbours. But you're certainly right. Once the suburb starts to mature, there's a town centre, the cafes, bars, the restaurants, your walking distance to a train station. An energy comes, and that's when the prices really start to grow, and the owner occupiers will certainly cement themselves. And then there's those other markets where they hold a stigma. And I love seeing a stigma. I love seeing that this market has a stigma for 1, 2, or 3 reasons. Whether it be there's social housing issues, or there's some noise, some kind of issue. But then that in time there's going to be shifts in the demographics, or that there is pent up demand coming to that market, or there's a shelf to how much supply can come. So some markets say, hey, there's too many apartments in that market, or too many houses, but they don't look that's it. There's no more coming to that market because it's landlocked or whatever else. So with that being said, where you and I, we talk about this, that Sydney has been growing because of a lot of domestic demand, because of the incentives, because of low interest rates. And what we have been saying is that once the borders open up, there's going to be students, tourism, and migration. What markets do you think would benefit most from those three key drivers, or from the country opening up again?
Look, it's a good question. I mean, Australia is one of the most desirable countries to be in the world, and Sydney, I think, is at the forefront of that. So, anywhere you've got the students are a huge driver of demand and pent up demand in property, because they're here to study, but they're also here to stay. So they want to establish themselves, in the city and live and work here, and they have their parent support and that sort of thing, coming from overseas. Some people are being sponsored to be here, but we have first class education facilities. We have first class. Obviously, suburbs, anywhere you go in the world, if you say you're from Australia, the first thing people say is, oh, Bondi Beach, So, and it makes you feel quite fortunate and humbled by it, because, I live in Sydney and I have access to those places that people just dream about. So, I think there'll be an enormous benefit once migration returns to its normal capacity. I mean, everybody has to remember we're missing out on 180 to 200,000 people a year coming into the country. That's a lot. That's a lot. And so if things are doing, if things are performing the way they are now, then imagine 200,000 people coming into that pool. It's gonna create a huge benefit. So anywhere where there's good transport, good infrastructure, good lifestyle amenity, I think is going to be very desirable. And again, in emerging suburbs, as you say, is key, because an increase in demand, you're talking about there's a whole pent up demand now. Imagine when migration comes back, that's what's going to be the conduit for enormous uplift. So regentrification is a real thing, and we're seeing these projects come to life. Like, I don't know if you've used the new West Connects, but that's an absolute game changer, mate. You go in that tunnel and then you come out the other end in 5 minutes, and you've skipped so much, and you think, wowza, like what a great piece of infrastructure. And that's not even open properly yet. That's one entry and one exit. So when that opens up and it links the airport and links Western Sydney and it links all these suburbs together, it's huge. It's huge. And so, all of those things are going to contribute to people having a desire to live around these suburbs, because of the connectivity and the lifestyle amenity and the options that they have. You can go to your grocer or your prominent retailers. You can go out and get hot food at night and coffee. Obviously not now. It's things will return. Things will come back to normal. I mean, last year we saw, that typical V-shaped, change in trend where things declined because of COVID, and as soon as they lifted the restrictions, it just V-shaped back up again. So, as I said earlier, it's a resilient city, and with all these infrastructure projects and people starting to migrate back in, I think anywhere where there's good, solid infrastructure, good lifestyle choices, parks, schools, education, that's going to perform tremendously well.
So, I appreciate the fact that you're almost a little coy there, because you don't want to necessarily spruik the sites that you're working on, but you work with hundreds of thousands of apartments, houses, townhouses, lots and lots of developers. You're spread across Sydney. The CBRE network is very wide. For the listeners and the people that are watching this, they're probably saying, yeah, all well and good to go buy something in Bondi, or Marrickville or Redfern, because that makes sense. It's a no-brainer in many, many ways, because they're landlocked and they're amazing suburbs now, but it's too expensive. What would you say to people that are looking for something that's more entry level? You mentioned the West Connects, and you did mention key locations. Are there spots specifically that you think would be good locations or will have demand into the future that are price sensitive?
Yes, there are. There are. I'll give you two examples that I'm quite passionate about, and not to sound biased, but again, this is something I'm quite passionate about because I've seen it happen before. So you've got suburbs. If you go Greater Western Sydney, you've got suburbs like Rouse Hill, Tallawong. Rouse Hill and Tallawong are emerging suburbs. They're new. There's paddocks out there, and now they're sort of coming out of the ground. The metro line's being built there, and I think people have it's taken a back seat a little bit. But these are trains that operate every 5 minutes. They'll take you straight into eventually they'll take you straight into the city. It's no joke. This is real proper infrastructure. It's something that we've been lacking as a global city for quite some time, and this is brand new. It's got strong transport. It's got amazing infrastructure and amenity. It's got great schools. It's got its own sort of Rouse Hill shopping centre. It's got great retail amenity, great lifestyle choice amenity. And people think, oh, Rouse Hill, geez, it's a bit of a trek. It's not anymore. It's very easily accessible, and those infrastructure and transport links are going to make it even more accessible. And the biggest benefit of places like Rouse Hill and Tallawong is they're tremendously well priced. You can get a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom there with parking if you're a young couple or growing family or first home buyer. For under 700,000. Great finishes, great, as I say, great accessibility to amenity and the like. So it's something that if you're a first home buyer or a first time buyer or a limited budget buyer and you're going, I want to live in Surrey Hills, then you've got to swallow the realistic pill and say, okay, what can I get? And then as you buy into these emerging suburbs and benefit from the uplift in those suburbs, is when you're going to be able to be selective and be choosy, because you're getting that uplift where later down the track will give you bigger choices. I won't say better because these suburbs are better than other suburbs in their own right in some aspects. The second example is places that are in main on the fringe of main hubs. We're selling an apartment building in Auburn called Auburn Square. This is a suburb that's so underrated. It's such a hidden gem. You're talking about 30,000, I think it's 30,000 population there with 50% or 48% of those are tenants. So there's an enormous amount of rental demand. So if you're an investor or a first-time investor going, I've got a 20, 30% deposit saved for something on 600,000, you can get a 2-bedroom there and it yields about 4%. And that's hard to find. A 4% yielding property in Sydney is hard to find. It's got an anticipated population growth of 39% by 2036. 39%, Dom. That's more than Granville and Maryland combined. That's one suburb. Cumberland Council has been, awarded an enormous amount of money to continue the infrastructure that's happening around there. And people turn around and say, "Oh, but it's Auburn." But have you thought about the benefits there? There's an enormous amount of established retail. It's very, very, very good value. It's tremendous value. In fact, it's some of the best value at the moment. Like a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom there, 630,000. You're 2 stops to Parramatta CBD, and you're 40 minutes from the Sydney CBD. Where are you going to get that? So, I think, as I say, people got to swallow the realistic. Yeah. People got to swallow the realistic pill and go, okay, what's the best bang for my buck?
Can I ask the question? Because, I actually do think that's that's good value. What, Auburn's less than 20K from Sydney CBD, roughly?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, it's closer to the Sydney CBD than Parramatta is.
So it's less than 20Ks. You're buying a 2-bedroom for less than 650. I think that's good value. My only question that I would ask, and I can imagine a lot of people watching this, is what about supply? When you drive into these areas, have you got any concerns about the size of the development or the amount of supply in those markets? I mean, you pointed to the fact that there's a hell of a lot of demand, but is there anything else that we can talk about there?
Yeah, look, I think, there's an enormous amount of supply in Parramatta CBD, but there's also an enormous amount of demand where government bodies have now moved out there and there's an enormous uplift in workforce out there. But Parramatta's very expensive. You're talking about Auburn being 25 to up to 30% cheaper than buying in the Parramatta CBD. So what's going to happen is naturally people are priced out of locations like Parramatta like Westmead, where there's a strong sort of medical precinct and that sort of thing, and Northmead and the like, and start to naturally migrate, towards, and gravitate towards suburbs like Auburn. And so that's where the uplift is. So a suburb like Auburn is actually lacking in supply because eventually people are going to be priced out of these suburbs and have to go somewhere close by because there's, an increased demand. There's where they work or they affiliate strongly with that area. And the proof is in the pudding. Like Northmead is now one of the suburbs in Western Sydney where the houses have reached, just under $1 million. That's pretty heavy duty. That's $1 million for a house in Northmead. No one would have thunk it. But if you
Yeah.
bought in Northmead, say, 6 to 8 months ago and went, I'll give it a crack, happy days.
Yeah, it's funny.
So
Being in the industry as long as we have, you have to accept that you're going to be surprised, and you have to accept that you don't know it all. As an investor, you have
that's
to just
right.
go, wow, I didn't see that one coming. But then when you point the dots going backwards, you're like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. So thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that. So Tallawong, Auburn, two great suburbs we pay attention to. Tallawong because it's a new urban area. You've got the Metro West that's out that way, or Metro Northwest. And then you've got Auburn because it's less than 20 k's from the CBD, it's price sensitive, and you've really got a lot of that sprawling growth coming from both the city, but mostly from Parramatta, Westmead, and the tremendous amount of infrastructure that's going into that catchment area.
Yeah, that's right. And it's extremely innovative. If you haven't, and this is probably more so for your listeners, if you haven't been to Parramatta recently, I strongly recommend, if you're not going 10 k's further than your suburb at the moment or your LGA, I strongly recommend going there and just driving around the streets, and you will be amazed at the innovation, the infrastructure there. Parramatta Square, there's a vertical university now, the vertical building university. These are things that are, we're reinventing the way we do things, and these suburbs are, I'll say, rife with opportunity to do that. It's the new way of doing things, and it's so advanced. It's tremendous. But once you see it, you'll appreciate it a lot more, I think.
That's an important point that I think there's a lot of, desk jockeys. Everybody now has all the information at their fingertips. So it's tempting to do all of your research in front of your computer, but real estate is a network asset. It's a real physical, tangible thing. And if you're going to go buy real estate, you've got to jump in your car when you can, and you have to drive around. You've got to explore. You've got to get your hands dirty, and you've got to get a sense of how other people live. Because, just because you live and you love your area, some people don't like your area. You've got to get a sense of how other people live and how the masses live, because that's an indication of where the demand's coming from. Good point.
Totally. And one thing my boss always says to me is go out there and burn some shoe leather. So always says it to me, go out there and burn some shoe. You have to burn your shoe leather, go out there and hit the pavement, get on the beat and have a coffee in the area and have a chat to people. And you'll learn a lot. In a very short amount of time, you'll learn a lot.
So Simon, I want to say thank you for everything that you've said so far. You've given us some really good tips. We've got to talk a lot about Sydney market and different areas. But have you got one last tip for our listeners that are out there? So what's your one big tip for all of our investors that are watching and listening if they're going to go out and buy some real estate in the next 3 to 6 months?
A couple of things. Don't necessarily go with the grain. Don't be afraid to go against the grain a little bit. If you just have a broader think about things and don't listen to the neighbor or the mechanic or whoever tells you, oh, mate, don't do that. This is what I heard or this is what I read. Don't absorb too much of what you read and that sort of thing. I mean, take 10% or something to that effect. I don't know if you remember in 2018, I think it was, or 19, there was a segment on 60 Minutes called Bricks and Slaughter. And it was a segment about some expert economist, and I hope he watches this, where he said, property prices in Sydney are going to drop by 50%. And that would mean you could buy Harbour Bridge views that used to be $3 million in, I don't know, Neutral Bay for $1.5 million. And look where we are now. I mean, last quarter we had an 8.2% increase in our in housing in Sydney. So don't worry about the scare tactics or the doomsday that you hear on in the media. Go out there, make an educated sort of educate yourself on facts and what's happening and potential growth, and don't be afraid. Property is something that people make real money when they play with property, and it's proven itself to be extremely resilient, and I think it's still got a very, very long way to go. If you compare Sydney to other capital cities in the world, we're still sort of way behind the eight ball. So we've still got a long way to go. Don't be afraid. Your money's always going to be in that property, and just go out there and compete. Have a crack.
I really, really like that last point, because not enough people really think about how Sydney property prices or how Australian property prices scale relative to the rest of the world. So people will say, hey, Sydney's expensive, Melbourne's expensive, compared to whatever, yesterday, right? Compared to 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But they don't have a look at how Sydney scales as property prices relative to other global cities. And they don't consider or think about how good a place we live in. So, that's a really, really important point. There's so much growth left in this market. It's because we live in a really good real estate market. The government's, whether you lean one way or another, it's a stable political environment. We've got clean air. We've got great education. We've got good food on our table. We've got some of the most beautiful scenery. There's a lot to love about this city and certainly this country. So, Simon,
mate, we're very fortunate to be here.
So I want to say thank you again. Appreciate all the feedback. It'd be good to have you back on the show in the next couple of months, just to see what the update is and what the word is on the street. We'll catch you all later. Thank you all for listening. Subscribe, like, share it with all your friends, and I will catch you all soon.
Thanks, Domenic.